I thought I was ready. That is the thing I keep coming back to. I had told myself for months that I was ready. I had signed the papers. I had agreed to every term without arguing, not because the terms were fair, but because I needed it to be over. I had hired the moving company, packed the boxes, watched the furniture go out the front door piece by piece until the rooms were bare. I had done everything a person is supposed to do. And then, on a Thursday morning in March, I pulled into the driveway of that house one last time. And I sat in my car for a few minutes before I could make myself get out. The house looked the same as it always had from the outside. White siding, green shutters, the oak tree in the front yard that had been a sapling when we planted it and was now taller than the roofline. Same as always. And I thought, I am ready. I have done the work. I can walk through that door and do what needs to be done and drive away. I was not ready. Not even close. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the house first. Because this story is really about the house and about what we put into the places we live without ever meaning to, without ever realizing it's happening until the day we have to leave. Gary and I bought the house in the spring, 21 years ago. We had been married for 2 years. We were both 31, which felt very grown up at the time and seems very young to me now. We had been renting an apartment downtown Charlotte, a small 2-bedroom on the 4th floor with thin walls and a parking situation that caused more arguments between us than anything else in those early years. When we found the house, we drove out to the suburbs on a Saturday afternoon and walked through it with a realtor named Susan, who wore too much perfume and talked very fast. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths. A kitchen with a window that faced east, so the morning light came in across the counter in a way that made everything look warmer than it was. A backyard with a wooden fence and enough space for a garden or a play set or whatever came next. What came next was Megan, 2 years after we moved in, and then Tyler, 3 years after Megan. I had both of them in that house. Not literally. I brought them home to that house, those small, impossible creatures, and laid them in the cribs we had assembled in the rooms we had painted and worried over. Megan's room we painted yellow the first time. Then she made us repaint it a pale green when she was 5, and then she made us do it again in a shade of lavender she had picked out herself from a paint chip at the hardware store when she was 12. I had suggested repainting it twice since then. She refused, both times. When she left for college at 18 and I finally walked into that empty room, those lavender walls were still exactly the color she had chosen when she was 12 years old. I had kept them. I don't know exactly why, I just had. Tyler's room was blue, a straightforward, uncomplicated blue that he picked when he was about 7 and never changed his mind about, which is very Tyler. He stuck a poster above his desk, some basketball player whose name I could never remember, and it was there so long that when we finally took it down before the first open house, there was a pale rectangle on the wall where the paint hadn't faded the same way. A ghost of a poster. A ghost of a boy who used to do his homework at that desk and yell at video games too late on school nights and sneak out the window at 15, which I knew about and pretended not to know about because some things a mother sees and quietly decides to let be. Gary and I had the big bedroom at the end of the hall. We had a good mattress and curtains I had picked out 3 times because the first 2 sets were wrong in ways I couldn't fully explain, and a closet that was never quite big enough and caused a low-grade ongoing negotiation for 20 years. It was our room in a way that the rest of the house wasn't quite, which is a strange thing about bedrooms. They hold something different, some more concentrated version of whatever a life together actually is. We had 21 years in that house. Not all of them were good. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of this story where I look back on the marriage as all sweetness and the divorce as all tragedy, and that version would not be true. Gary and I had good years and years that were mostly just ordinary, which is the bulk of any marriage. The ordinary years, the Tuesday evenings and Saturday errands, and the same dinners rotating on the same schedule, and the same conversations that weren't really conversations anymore. I don't want to go into all of it. The marriage is its own story, long and complicated, and not entirely mine to tell. What I will say is that somewhere in our late 40s, Gary and I stopped being able to find each other. Not through cruelty or betrayal, just through the slow drift that happens when two people are busy and tired and stop paying attention to the distance growing between them. By the time we started talking about it seriously, there was a lot of distance to account for. Gary moved out 18 months before I handed over the keys. He took his things and moved into an apartment about 4 miles away, and I stayed in the house because the kids needed it to be there. Tyler was still finishing his last year of high school, and even Megan, who was already at college by then, needed her childhood home to exist somewhere. That was how I explained it to myself at the time. I needed the house to remain for the kids. Looking back, I think I also needed it for myself. I was not ready to let it go. The divorce took 11 months to finalize. That is a long time to spend in the legal machinery of ending something. Our lawyers were polite and efficient, and it cost more than I want to think about. The house had to be sold and the proceeds divided. That was the ruling, and I agreed to it, and I signed what needed to be signed. I just needed it to be over. The arguing, the paperwork, the phone calls about who got which piece of furniture, the whole exhausting architecture of dismantling a life. I wanted all of it to stop. The house went on the market 8 months before closing day. I hated the showing process. I knew it was necessary. I understood that strangers had to walk through in order for the house to sell, but something about it felt deeply wrong every single time. I would get a text from the realtor, Susan again, same woman who had sold us the house 21 years earlier, which felt like either a coincidence or the universe making a point. And I would have an hour to get out before the prospective buyers arrived. I would drive to the grocery store or just park on a quiet street 2 blocks away and sit with the radio on, waiting for the all-clear text. Once, from where I was parked, I could see people coming out the front door. A couple, middle-aged, standing on my front porch discussing something. The woman pointed at the oak tree. The man shrugged. They went back inside. I watched the front door close behind them and thought, please don't love it. Please don't buy it. And then I caught myself thinking that and felt ashamed, because selling it was the whole point. The buyers who made an offer were named Ashley and Jason. The realtor told me they were around 30, married 2 years, expecting their first child in the summer. Ashley had seen the house online at 11 o'clock at night and sent Jason a message that just said, "This is it." Susan told me that detail with a smile, the way realtors do, presenting it as a gift. A young family, a baby coming, their whole life ahead of them, in the house where my whole life had already happened. I found Ashley's social media profile the same afternoon. I am not proud of that either, but I did it. She was bright-faced and clearly happy, with the kind of open smile that belongs to people who haven't yet been weathered by very much. In her most recent photo, she was standing in front of a Christmas tree, her hand resting on her stomach in that particular way pregnant women have, like a quiet announcement. I looked at the photo for a long time. Then I put my phone away and went to do something useful. The closing was set for a Thursday morning. I arranged to be at the house by 8, an hour before the scheduled meeting with Susan and the title company. Just to do a final walkthrough, I told myself, make sure everything was in order, check that nothing had been left behind, no light fixtures missing, no damage from the move. That was what I told myself. I parked in the driveway and sat there longer than I meant to. The oak tree was budding, early March, and already there was the faint green haze of new leaves starting. Gary and I had planted that tree the first spring after we moved in. It was barely taller than Tyler is now when we put it in the ground. I remembered Gary digging the hole, and Tyler, who wasn't born yet, didn't exist yet, was years away from existing. But I always think of Tyler when I think of that tree. Something about the stubbornness of how it grew. I got out of the car. I used my key for the last time. The door swung open and I went inside. The sound of an empty house is something you don't forget once you've heard it. It's not silence exactly. It's a particular quality of quiet that has echo in it, the way a space sounds when it's been cleared of everything soft. 21 years of furniture and rugs and curtains and the general accumulated softness of a family living somewhere. All of it gone, and what was left was this hollow, honest sound. My footsteps on the hardwood, the furnace ticking somewhere in the basement, my own breathing. I stood in the front hallway for a moment. The floor was the same floor. We had refinished it 12 years ago after Tyler drove a toy truck across it repeatedly and left a line of small dents that drove me crazy until the day we sanded them out. The walls were the same off-white they had been for the last several years, after we moved away from the various attempts at color that had happened in the rooms over 2 decades. The staircase was the same staircase where Megan had sat one Christmas Eve when she was about 8, convinced she could stay awake until midnight, and where I had found her at 10:30, asleep against the banister, her head tipped sideways and her mouth slightly open. I went to the kitchen first. The kitchen window faced east. Gary and I had noticed that on the first showing 21 years ago, and it was one of the things that made us decide. Morning light. There is something about morning light in a kitchen that makes a person feel like things are going to be all right. And I had needed that feeling more mornings than I could count. I stood at the counter where the coffee maker had been and looked out the window at the backyard and the pale March light coming through the glass, and I thought, I have stood here so many times. I have stood here in the dark at 5 in the morning when one of the babies was sick and I couldn't sleep. I have stood here in the bright July heat watching the kids play in the yard. I have stood here in the ordinary gray of 1,000 Tuesday mornings thinking about nothing in particular, just making coffee, just starting a day. I thought about Tyler at the kitchen table when he was about 7, coming downstairs in his pajamas with his hair going in every direction and telling me, completely seriously, that he had dreamed about a dinosaur who knew how to make pancakes. He wanted to know if I thought dinosaurs would have liked maple syrup. I told him I thought they probably would have. He thought about this for a while and then said, that seemed right. I don't know why that memory is the one that came to me in the kitchen. Out of 21 years of mornings. I suppose the mind chooses what it chooses. I left the kitchen and went upstairs. Megan's room was the first door on the left. I pushed it open slowly, the way I used to when I was checking if she was asleep. The lavender walls were still lavender, a little faded now. The sun had come through those east-facing windows for 6 years since she'd chosen that color, but still unmistakably the shade she had held up on that paint chip and said, with the absolute certainty of a 12-year-old who has found the exact right thing, "That one, Mom, that one." I stood in the doorway and thought about Megan at 12. That particular age, when she was right at the edge of leaving childhood and she knew it and was both excited and terrified. And she expressed that terror mostly by being furious at me for things that had nothing to do with what she was actually feeling. We had hard years, Megan and I, through her early teens, the kind of hard that mothers and daughters have sometimes, where you are too alike in the wrong ways and can't help but strike sparks off each other. There were slammed doors in this house. There were things said that we both had to learn to let go of later. But there was also the night she came home from her first real heartbreak, 17 years old, crying in the car. And instead of going to her room, she came and found me in the kitchen and just sat down at the table and said nothing for a while. And I sat with her and said nothing back. We stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, and then she said, "I just didn't think it would feel like this." And I said, "I know." And she looked at me like maybe I actually did know, like maybe I was a person and not just her mother, and something shifted between us that night. Slowly, over the years that followed, we found our way to something better. Something that felt now like genuine friendship alongside the mother-daughter thing. I was grateful for that. I don't take it for granted. I didn't go into Megan's room. I just stood in the doorway and looked at the lavender walls and thought about the paint chip and the 12-year-old and all the years in between. Then I moved on. Tyler's room was across the hall. The pale rectangle was still there on the wall where the poster had been. I had known it would be, and still it stopped me when I saw it. The ghost of that basketball player whose name I could never remember, hovering in the slightly darker paint. I walked to the window, Tyler's window, the one with the old-fashioned latch that he had figured out how to open silently by the time he was 15, which I knew because I had heard him do it one night and lay in my bed deciding whether to get up and say something, and ultimately deciding not to. He was a good kid. He wasn't going anywhere dangerous. He just needed to feel like he could get out if he wanted to. I understood that. Tyler had been 20 years old when the divorce became official. Old enough to understand everything, young enough for it to still shake something in him. He didn't talk about it much, which is Tyler's way. He processes things internally and then eventually, weeks later, says one precise thing that makes it clear he has thought about it more carefully than anyone realized. He called me one Sunday night about 4 months after Gary moved out and said, out of nowhere, "Mom, you know this isn't your fault, right?" I had said, of course I knew that." And he said, "I just wanted to say it out loud." And then we talked about his classes for 20 minutes like nothing had happened. I stood in his room and looked at the window and the ghost on the wall and the scuff marks on the floor where his desk had been. And I thought about the person who would grow up in this room next. Ashley and Jason's baby. A new child with no connection to any of this, who would look at these walls and make them into something entirely new. I found I didn't mind that as much as I expected to. There was something right about it, actually. Houses need to keep going. They need new families and new children and new memories piling up on top of the old ones. That is what they're for. I went to our bedroom last, Gary's and mine. I stopped at the door the same way I had stopped at Megan's, but this one was harder to walk into. I'm not sure I could fully explain why. The room was just a room, just 4 walls and a floor and 2 windows that looked out over the side yard. But I stood there in the doorway for a long time before I finally went in. I went to the window and looked out at the side yard, the narrow strip of grass between our fence and the neighbor's fence, where nothing much had ever happened, except that it got mowed every 2 weeks in summer. I thought about Gary. I tried to think about him honestly, the way I have been learning to do, without the bitterness that comes from the hard years, but also without the false softness that comes from grief. Gary was a good man in many ways. He was a dedicated father and a hard worker, and he was funny in a dry, quiet way that I had loved very much in the beginning and still appreciated even now. He was not good at asking for what he needed, and neither was I, and we had spent a lot of years failing to tell each other things that might have helped. I don't know if we could have saved the marriage if we had tried harder. I used to believe we could have. Now I'm less sure. Some things run their course. Some incompatibilities are so deep that by the time you see them clearly, it's already too late to work around them. I thought about the morning we moved in. We had no furniture yet. The truck was coming in the afternoon, and we sat on the floor of this room eating sandwiches we had brought from a deli downtown. And Gary had said something that made me laugh so hard I spilled my drink, and we had laughed about that too. And I had looked around at the empty room with the afternoon light coming in and thought, this is ours. We made this. Whatever comes next, we made this together. That was real. Whatever came after, that was real. I stood at the window for a long time. Then I went downstairs and out the back door. The backyard was brown and flat with late winter. The garden beds along the fence were bare. The corner where the play set had stood for 12 years, the one with the slide and the little climbing wall and the wooden fort on top that the kids had named solemnly Fort Maximum, was just grass now, slightly sunken where the posts had been. We had taken the playset down 3 years ago. The kids were long past it, and it had been weathering for a while, and the neighbor's kid had grown into it and then out of it too. And one Saturday, Gary had started taking it apart, and I had helped, and we had worked together in the yard all afternoon without arguing, which had felt like something by then. We had stood in the yard afterward, looking at the bare corner, and Gary had said, "That went fast," and I had said, "It really did." And we had both meant more than the playset and both known it. I sat down on the back steps. The wood was cold through my coat. Every summer for 17 years, we had had people in this yard. The 4th of July barbecues, Gary at the grill, the neighbor Dave bringing his famous potato salad that was famous mostly because he called it famous. The kids running through the sprinkler until they were exhausted, and someone's child always ended up crying about something and recovering in about 4 minutes. The fall weekends raking leaves into piles that Tyler would immediately jump into and unmake. The one summer, Megan decided she was going to grow her own vegetables and planted tomatoes and zucchini and tended them with complete seriousness for about 3 weeks before losing interest, though the tomatoes actually came in beautifully that August, and we ate them all summer. I sat on those steps and I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet, persistent kind of crying that comes when you have been holding something tightly for a very long time and your hands finally give out. I cried for the house and for the marriage and for the play set and for the tomatoes and for Gary in the early years before we lost the thread. I cried for Tyler on his bedroom floor at 3 a.m. after his first real breakup, when I sat with him and didn't know what to say and just stayed because staying was the only thing I could think of. I cried for Megan's lavender walls and for the dinosaur who knew how to make pancakes. I cried for the version of myself who stood in the empty kitchen 21 years ago and thought she knew how everything was going to go. I cried for a while, and then I stopped. And the backyard was still the backyard, bare and brown and cold, and I was still sitting on the steps, and somewhere a bird was making noise in the oak tree out front. My phone buzzed. It was Megan. She had a way of calling at the exact right moment. I used to wonder if she somehow knew, and then I realized that she probably called on ordinary days too, and I just didn't notice as much. I answered. She said, "Hey, how are you doing?" I said, "I'm at the house." There was a small pause. Then she said, "Oh, are you okay?" I said, "I was just sitting on the back steps." She didn't say anything right away. She didn't try to fix it or suggest I go get coffee or tell me it was all going to be fine. She just stayed on the line. And I sat on the steps with the phone against my ear and felt the cold through my coat and listened to my daughter breathe, 300 miles away in the apartment where she lived her adult life. And something in me loosened just slightly, just enough. After a little while, she said, "I used to love those steps." I said, "I know." She said, "Tyler used to try to jump off them, and you always told him not to." I said, "He did it anyway." She said, "He always did it anyway." We were both quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, you built something really good there. Whatever happened at the end, you built something good. That doesn't go away." I did not trust myself to say very much after that. I told her I loved her. She said she loved me back. I told her I'd call her later, and she said, "Okay," and we hung up. I sat on the steps a little longer. Then I got up, brushed off my coat, and went back inside. Susan arrived at 9, right on time. She was warm and professional, and she walked through each room with me, making notes on a clipboard, checking faucets and light switches the way you do at the end of a transaction, making sure everything is in order, making sure what is being transferred matches what was agreed to. She was good at her job. She had been good at her job 21 years ago, too. Ashley and Jason arrived 10 minutes later. They came in together, Jason holding the door for Ashley the way young couples do when they are still very conscious of each other. Ashley was visibly pregnant now, maybe 7 months, maybe a little more, and she moved carefully, with that particular awareness of her own center of gravity that I remembered from both of my pregnancies. She was wearing a green coat that brought out the color in her eyes. She walked into the front hallway and stopped and looked around, and I recognized the expression on her face completely. It was the expression of someone who has already decided, this is home. It was the same expression I had worn in this hallway 21 years ago, looking up at the staircase and the light coming through the window on the landing and thinking, yes, this is it. This is the one. Jason was looking at the ceiling, checking something structural the way men do. Ashley was looking at everything else. She turned to me and said, "We're going to take such good care of it." She said it simply, without performance, just as a fact she wanted me to know. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the play set and the lavender walls and the dinosaur who liked maple syrup and the 4th of July, and the tomatoes, and all of it, all 21 years of it, contained inside these walls that were now going to belong to her. I said, "I know you will." And I meant it. That surprised me a little, but I meant it completely. We signed the last of the papers at a table in the empty dining room. Susan had brought a folder and a pen, and I initialed where she pointed and signed where she pointed. And when it was done, she handed me a copy and said, "Congratulations, Linda, you're all set." I looked at the key in my hand. I had carried it for 21 years. It was worn smooth in one particular spot from being handled so many times. I set it on the table. Ashley picked it up carefully. She held it for a second, looking at it, and then she closed her hand around it and looked at Jason, and he put his arm around her, and they both looked so young, so completely and honestly young, that I had to look away for a moment. I shook their hands. I shook Susan's hand. I picked up my purse from where I had set it on the floor, and I walked to the front door, and I opened it, and I went out. I sat in my car on the quiet street 2 blocks away, the same street where I used to park during the showings, waiting for the all-clear text. The last time I would park here for this reason, the last time I would need to. I sat there and watched the street and thought about nothing in particular, which was strange because for months I had been thinking about this day constantly, and now that it was here, I seemed to have run out of thoughts. Just the street, and the oak tree visible from where I was parked, its new leaves bright green in the March light, and the quiet, ordinary morning going on around me. After a while, I saw Ashley and Jason come out the front door. They stood on the porch together, looking out at the yard. Ashley said something, and Jason laughed. They went back inside. The door closed. I watched the door for another moment. Then I started the car. My apartment is on the third floor of a building about 4 miles from the house. I had moved in 4 months before the closing, when it became clear that staying in the house through the final stages of the sale was going to be more than I could manage. It was a 2-bedroom, one for me, one that was technically a guest room, but that I had filled mostly with boxes I hadn't finished unpacking. The living room had a window that faced west, which meant I got the evening light instead of the morning light, and that had taken some getting used to. I had not fully made it mine yet. That was the honest truth. I had hung some pictures and put down a rug I liked and bought curtains that were the right color, but it still felt sometimes like a place I was staying rather than a place I lived. I knew that would change. I had known it for weeks in the way you know things before you feel them, intellectually, from a distance. I parked in the garage and took the elevator to the 3rd floor and unlocked my door and went inside. The apartment was quiet the way my apartments were always quiet, not the echoing, hollow quiet of the empty house, but the soft, settled quiet of a place that was small enough to feel contained. My things were here. My books on the shelves I had put up myself. My coffee maker on the kitchen counter. The photograph of Megan and Tyler on the credenza by the door. The one from Megan's college graduation where they are both laughing at something out of frame and neither of them knows the camera is on them. I put my purse down. I put my coat on the hook by the door. I went to the kitchen and filled the kettle and set it on the stove. While I waited for the water to boil, I stood at the window. The window faced west, and it was mid-morning, so the light was coming in sideways and mild, the way March light is. Not warm exactly, but no longer cold. I could see a slice of the parking lot and some trees beyond it, and the roof of the building across the street. Not much of a view, but it was mine, which is something. I thought about what Megan had said on the back steps. You built something good there. That doesn't go away. She was right. I had built something in that house. A family. A 21-year life with all its complications, and its ordinary Tuesday evenings, and its 4th of July barbecues, and its lavender walls, and its ghost of a poster, and its playset in the corner of the yard. All of it was real. All of it had happened. The divorce had ended the marriage, but it had not undone any of that. The children were real. The mornings were real. The tree in the front yard that Gary and I had planted when we were 31 years old and impossibly optimistic was real. And it was still there, and it would probably outlast all of us. The kettle started to whistle. I made my tea. I carried it to the chair by the window and I sat down, and the March light came in sideways across the room, and outside a bird was doing something in the tree across the street, and the building was quiet around me. I had been trying for months to figure out what home meant now. I had been waiting to feel at home here, waiting for the apartment to stop feeling temporary, waiting for something to shift. It occurred to me, sitting there with my tea, that maybe I had been thinking about it wrong. Maybe home is not a feeling that a place gives you. Maybe it is something you carry with you, something you build in yourself over time, out of the choices you make and the people you love, and the mornings you get up and try again. Maybe you don't find it. Maybe you make it, slowly, out of whatever you have. I did not know yet who I was going to be in this apartment. In this new chapter of my life, without the house, without the marriage, without the daily shape that 21 years had given me. I did not know what the next version of my life was going to look like. I could not see it clearly. But I was starting to think that might be all right. I was starting to think that not being able to see it clearly was not the same as it not being there. The tea was good. The chair was comfortable. The The light was coming in from the west, which I was getting used to. Megan was going to visit next month. Tyler was talking about coming out in the summer. I had a book I had been meaning to read for 6 months. I had a neighbor down the hall named Francis who had knocked on my door in January with a plate of cookies and who I had talked to for 45 minutes in the hallway and who I thought I might eventually know well. I had a window. I had an address that was mine. I had a life that was not finished being built. I sat there and drank my tea and watched the light move slowly across the floor the way light does when you are still enough to notice it, and I thought, this is where I am. This is what is real right now. Not the house, not the marriage, not the 21 years. This room, this light, this cup. And very slowly, like something that had been clenched for a long time finally letting go, I felt myself begin to settle. Not arrive, not finish, just settle. For now, that was enough.